Hello everybody, and welcome to this next video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Program. My name is Andrew Knight and I sit within the Regulatory Standards and Thought Leadership part of RICS. I've been with RICS for over 11 years now, and my role is to look at the impact of data and technology right across the built and natural environment and how that impacts our profession and indeed their clients. With over 130,000 members working worldwide, right across the property life cycle through land, development, construction, brokerage, valuation, building operation. It's a very, very wide canvas upon which data and technology is having a very profound impact. And also our members work with lots of different asset types. So they work with rural land, they work with residential, they work with various commercial types of real estate, and they work with infrastructure. So it's a very, very broad area in which, as I say, data is having a very profound effect. And I'm really glad today to have Ivo back with me from the Proptech Connection. So Ivo, please do join me.
Hey, Andrew. A very good afternoon. How are you? Good seeing you.
Same to you. Good afternoon. Great to have you back on the call. For those who perhaps didn't catch the first session, it'd be great to have a bit of background on yourself, your skills and experience, and indeed how the Proptech Connection came to be.
Yeah, super. So yeah, thanks again for having me here today. About myself, maybe very high level synopsis. Born and raised in Europe. Lived in different continents, so moved and worked in Asia, South America, and now actually residing in the US. Got involved in real estate and pivoted into PropTech 2017 or so. Did some consulting work for a small Wall Street investment bank, and then set up the Proptech Connection, where I'm a co-founder and I basically lead our global origination and network efforts. And what we basically do is we act as a bridge and sit in the middle between the three different actors in the ecosystem. So on one end you have the investors, on the other end the tech buyers, as we call them, and obviously the startups or the PropTechs, and we basically sit in between those three parties, and then we bring those opportunities in a global context. So see us as an originator for all the three different actors, and I think we've built a strong brand, a name in the ecosystem, have an excellent network, I would say, and probably two things that I wanted to point out with our skill set and our team. Where we are different, I think, is twofold. One, our team has sat in every seat. So we worked as a PropTech investor, we worked as a PropTech buyer, and extensive with the startups. So we understand everybody. We hear primarily from the technology buyer side that there's a lot of noise in the space. A lot of people talk about PropTech and overinflated expectations and not really understanding that ecosystem. So we did that. We work extensively in the real estate side and also in the tech. So we understand all these different folks in the ecosystem, and we do this in international context. So we have a very large global network, and we are able to bring opportunities from Brazil into Europe. We bring US companies to APAC, we bring Aussie companies to Europe, etc. So yeah, that's very high synopsis, me and what we do.
Thanks, Ivo. I mean, with that wonderful sort of helicopter view, to use the horrible jargon you've got from that global perspective, if we think about kind of particular jurisdictions, either regionally or some of the larger markets, what kind of trends are you seeing that are either global or perhaps more localized, as in the Americas or Europe or Asia Pac?
Yeah, so I think it's a couple different things. Obviously, what we always like to do at the PropTech Connection, we like to look at things from a global perspective. So what are some of these macro drivers, right? So obviously, what's the impact of COVID, and how does that relate into what we are actually seeing in the market, and what is then the opportunity for both the buyers and the investors? So some of the key things, I think, given that regional question, right, that you asked about different regions, I think a couple things that I wanted to point out there. One is that different regions have different problems, right? So PropTech is very bespoke, and obviously it's something that has been around for quite some time, but in emerging markets, the problems are much more significant in terms of where we were 20 or 30 years ago, let's say. So that's one thing that I wanted to point out. So for example, in Africa, there's still, you pay very high commissions, you need to pay 1 year of rent up front. So, digitizing that process, which obviously in the UK or the US is already pretty straightforward, is still a massive opportunity there. So that's the first thing that I wanted to point out. So those are some of the regions where we are looking very strongly into. So Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, Vietnam, Indonesia, massive markets where the demographics are still very young, where a lot of those young people have no access to affordable living or housing. we see a lot of good tech coming in there and very good investment opportunities as well, potentially. So that's one thing. I think the second thing that I also like to point out, which we believe is important, that geographical proximity doesn't necessarily mean success. So obviously on the tech world, you have the ability to obviously deploy and implement some of those solutions from a far distance. So what we always try to do with our clients is really sit with the buyer, with those real estate companies or those agencies, and really unpack what their commercial drive is, what their commercial problem is, and then basically being able to match that in a global scale with the technology that actually serves the purpose the best, right? So that's something that I think is very important. And then the third piece, in terms of something that we think is very much on the forefront, is basically asset repurposing, right? Because what you see now because of COVID primarily is that a lot of cities are changing, right? And they're changing pretty quickly, and you see a lot of these CBDs are empty, right? As we chatted already earlier today about empty office spaces, etc. So we think with some other developments that are going on, there's an incredible opportunity to tackle that problem. We see a lot of tech coming in from that side. I think in Europe and the US, the more, let's say, advanced Proptech ecosystems, what we see there, it's we see a lot of interest around data. So you see a couple of things. You see a lot of real estate companies building their own proprietary systems in-house. I think that's one thing. Another thing that we see is that the race to the bottom, so trying to capture data as early as possible. And then the second one, which we actually see in every conversation, and I'm sure you've heard it also every time, is that ESG angle. And I think now is really the time to deliver, because again, obviously the Ukraine-Russia war or conflict, I would call it a war, is obviously having a direct impact on commodity prices, energy pricing. So now is really the time. Are people willing to pay a premium to do the right thing, right? And what we see in the market is that a lot of these institutional players are actually very eager to find solutions to implement them. So it's not about that talking, and it's really about finding good tech and implement it into their portfolios.
Thanks. I mean, you mentioned a couple of areas there specifically, I suppose, around focus on particular parts of the property lifecycle, that kind of building management, and which is obviously linked to ESG. From that perspective, given that our members are working right across that lifecycle through construction, valuation, brokerage, from that kind of sort of sector perspective, what are you seeing in terms of behaviors and trends?
So I would say we hear a lot about life cycle assessment products. So we see a lot of folks trying to solve it. You also start to see that a lot of senior researchers are getting into that ecosystem, right? So they have they have the network, they have the name and the reputation, and they really understand it, and they also understand the opportunity given all the regulatory pressure that comes in. So we're very, very interested and excited to see what's coming out there. So but a lot of those companies are actually very, very early. But I think that's an incredible opportunity.
And how about from a kind of a technology platform perspective? I mean, there's been lots of seminars on recently about the metaverse, and clearly there's still a lot of activity around blockchain, distributed ledgers, and drones, and obviously AI. Where do you see the kind of the real trends around the kind of technology and platforms at the moment? What are people actually deploying?
Yes, so we at the Proptech Connection look at the market a little bit differently. So we don't think nobody wants like an AI solution or machine learning. So we always start with the commercial driver, right? So what is that commercial problem? And then what kind of technology is able to service that? So what we then do, we sit with a buyer and actually we unpack. So we have 125 data point analysis where we actually unpack that commercial rationale. We write a report about that, and then we match that one with our database. So we have 15,000 Proptechs in our database. We have 800 data dictionaries sitting behind that, and then we roll it up into thematics. So we do that, and then we go to our network, given that the ecosystem obviously is really rapidly evolving, and then we bring those two together. So for us, it's not necessarily about what kind of tech is specifically used, but what tech is out there to actually solve that specific problem, right? Yeah, so that's the way we look at into the market. I think it has never been a better time to be in this ecosystem. Lots of capital pouring in. We see a lot of very, very interesting tech, but the key challenge I would say that we often see is is that disconnect between the Proptech side and the buy side, being able to articulate the value proposition, right? Really being able to show what your unique selling point is and what that value is for a potential buyer, and how you differentiate yourself against other companies. Because obviously what you must see, and also a lot of the other folks that are listening in here today, you have a lot of different companies that have pretty similar solutions, right? So it's really about being able to articulate it and obviously convince a buyer that you have the best tech to solve that specific problem.
Indeed. Now, it's funny, somebody I know in within the kind of community of PropTech in this area posted something on LinkedIn a few days ago, which sort of sparked quite a lot of conversation. And I guess to some extent, it's a slightly cliched comment and something that's been brought out a number of times, but it was around this sense of, you know, the PropTech world and how it integrates with what I might call the more traditional, long-established real estate and property firms, and how that dialogue is evolving, and a sense from this particular poster on LinkedIn that they're still not necessarily talking to each other, that they're talking over each other or past each other. Well, what are you seeing about that kind of relationship between, as I say, these very established property firms and consultancies and actors in the marketplace and these newer startups, and whether do you think that there's a danger that perhaps PropTech firms are still talking to each other too much and not to the market? How do you see that dynamic working?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think there is fatigue or there is no willingness on the buy side to implement tech. We don't think that's the case. We have actually a lot of our relationships that are C-suite folks, CIO, CTOs. We do a keynote that will come in 2 weeks. So I'm also at the private CIO session. So we're well connected there. And what we hear from those private conversations, that a lot of those folks are very, very keen to deploy tech. But real estate companies and problems are very bespoke, right? So the challenge for a lot of those, there's a lot of noise in PropTech. So these guys that, if you understand it from a buy perspective, they have 100 companies coming to them every day or every 2 days, knocking on the door saying, hey, I have the best solution. So they have a very delicate process, the way they assess and look for opportunities. And it's not easy, I would say, to be on the buy side. I think there is a lot of willingness to implement. I think there's a lot of capital also available. Yeah, so those are some of my thoughts. But please remind me on the second part of the question, which
well, it was almost about that sense, and I know I've certainly picked it up at certain events, both virtual and now face-to-face, where there's a danger sometimes that you go to a kind of PropTech event and it just feels like PropTech talking to PropTech, and that there perhaps still isn't that enough of that two-way street, and arguably, is there still a requirement in your sense for PropTech firms to get an even deeper understanding of real estate, given how idiosyncratic and, as you said, so often solutions need to be quite bespoke? Do you think there's still a way to go in terms of that conversation between the two parties?
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point that you raised. We think that's a major pain point in the industry. You have a lot of very talented folks on the PropTech side and the start side that come from different verticals, previously fintech, whatever that may be. Very, very talented, very, very good in building products, but not understanding real estate because they've never worked in it, or really having not that domain knowledge. So they're really not understanding what the client is and what their needs are and who they're selling into. So I think it's really important that you have somebody coming in and actually being able to articulate that value proposition in the right context. So I think that's definitely one. And then regarding that second point around events, I think events is a great tool, but it also is very difficult, right? Because you need to service 3 different folks of the ecosystem. And I think PropTechs are always keen because they want to meet investors, they want to meet buyers. But I think oftentimes buyers and investors, they already get a lot of inbound through social, LinkedIn or email, whatever that might be. So I think they oftentimes come because they want to get insights, and they don't want to be pitched at those events because they get pitched every day, right? So I think it's very difficult in those events to find the right balance, I would say. And I think you have different organizations that do that in different ways, and some may be more successful than others. But I think what you just raised is difficult to balance, I would say. So yeah, we think it's something. Yeah, it's difficult.
So, I mean, do you see PropTech firms being perhaps much more aware that they perhaps need to get people on their team from day one who are not just technically very astute, but also have that kind of domain knowledge? Do you sense an awareness of A, having to work more closely with potential customers, but just making sure their teams, dare I say, are more diverse in that sense, and not just great coders, great technicians, but having that domain knowledge for a sector that, as I say, is very idiosyncratic, isn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a really good point. I think that is really key. But at the same time, there's also challenges. So some of the things that we're seeing is actually more senior real estate folks coming into PropTech. So folks that are, have 20, 30, 40 years of experience within real estate, and then start actually launching or getting involved in these PropTechs at a very senior position. And those guys are obviously oftentimes able to scale because, again, they have the network on the real estate side, they understand it, so they can really take that journey. And then specifically in PropTech, we think being able to have success in PropTech, you really need to understand all the three different sides of the ecosystem. So finding people in that niche young industry that have experience on all those sides is very, very complicated, we think. So this is a problem that we hear from the largest real estate companies to the smaller ones and everyone in between.
Indeed. To change the topic slightly, I mean, I don't think many of us probably foresaw that one of the outcomes of the pandemic would be this monetary tightening now in terms of interest rates, and clearly that's had an effect in terms of valuations, given that future cash flows for these kind of companies are so critical to that valuation. What are you seeing in terms of the change of sentiment or activity from that investment perspective, given this pressure on valuations?
No, it's a really good point, and obviously equity markets have cooled down quite a bit, right, since the top in, what was it, January or so, and I think we may have the bottom in or not. You never know until a couple months after. But a couple of things that I think what we're seeing is, one, there's a lot of capital still pouring into the PropTech ecosystem. So we've been approached by a number of large institutional players that are looking into getting access into that ecosystem. So we talk about entities $200 to $300 billion plus in assets. So really big players wanting to come in. So these guys will come in, they will proceed, and obviously $100 million ticket is is small. So we don't think capital is the issue, but what you start to see, I think, is a couple things. One, on the VC side, multiples are falling, so valuation businesses are being repriced. That's one thing. The second piece is around, we think that capital will still be deployed, but it's got to be much more concentrated. So what we're seeing from investors is that they are looking for higher margins, stronger business models with different revenue streams, less appetite to go into markets that they're not as familiar with necessarily. So there is some caution, I would call it caution, in the market right now. And then on the PE side, I think a lot of those guys are getting excited because they have obviously a lot of cash sitting on the sidelines, and they are looking for those consolidation plays. And obviously with valuations falling, I think a lot of those guys are looking to scoop up and roll up some of these verticals in PropTech that are very, very busy. So I think for the M&A side, I think it's an exciting time coming up. So those are some of the things that we're seeing.
So I suppose, moving on to that almost theme, and obviously predictions, particularly for the future, are obviously very difficult, but how do you see the kind of challenges around PropTech firms scaling up, and also what the future looks like in terms of that consolidation M&A activity? Because arguably you could suggest that there are too many PropTech firms for a sustainable future in terms of the number of players that would have profitable business models. So what do you see as the future trajectory for that kind of M&A scale up type of landscape over the next, say, 3, 4, 5 years?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So we think that one of the key challenges, obviously, with PropTech is being able to scale in an international context, which is very, very challenging. So we think that route is typically going through the agencies because obviously they have that global network, right? And those are global businesses around the world. So we think that's the gateway into really scaling your business. That's I think is one. Second is around finding strategic partners. So what you start to see now is that a lot of these businesses in APAC or Europe are growing quite significantly, and once they have significant traction, I would say like at Series B stage, all wanting to come into the US, finding strategic partners that obviously have these large portfolios behind them. So I think that's a good pathway into different geographies. And then the third piece that I would bring up, it is a very, very busy space. We see a lot of, in certain verticals, it's a very busy space, right? You have geographical winners. So we think the only way to go at scale is either having these big guys coming in, publicly traded companies that we both know that are looking for scooping up a lot of those businesses. But yeah, those are some of the things that we're looking at. And we also think, last point in terms of Proptech, we think Proptech is much stickier. So you see now also a lot of generic VC funds starting to look into Proptech, looking for opportunities. Construction tech, I think we see a lot of activity, but not very familiar with the ecosystem, the network. Business models are a little bit different than pure SaaS models, oftentimes that they're used to with the multiples, etc. And I think there's a significant opportunity also for these startups to get some more visibility with some of those funds.
Indeed. Well, as ever, Ivo, it's been fascinating to talk, and I look forward to catching up, perhaps not quite so long, the next gap between us chatting about how the market's developing. So for today, thanks as ever for your time. It's been very illuminating, and I look forward to catching up later in the year.
Fantastic. Thanks for having us, Andrew. I really appreciate it.